So you know what the number one, or close to the number one conversation I have with recruiters involves failure. Every day a recruiter is teetering on the edge of rejection and failure. And it's not just rejection from, supervisors or peers. It's rejection from, clueless teenagers who are sometimes very rude or forward with their rejection. Like, I'm not interested in joining the Army and you're a loser or you're a killer or whatever. Some kind of inappropriate, untimely, untoward remark. And a lot of times people will say, well, don't take it personal. It's just whatever, part of the job, or it's just an unwise teenager. But it's easier said than done not to take failure personally or not to take rejection personally. A lot of times rejection will kind of weave itself into the fabric of our psyche or our mind, and we'll think of ourselves as a failure. I'm a failure at work. I'm a failure. And then it can, I'm a failure at home and I can't do anything right. And a lot of times for recruiters who are typically phenomenal soldiers, they're used to success. They're used to whatever they do, succeeding at. So it's a real difficult and challenging thing for a recruiter to deal with, to be in a world where failure and rejection is like part of the world that they're in. It's like a baseball player. The best baseball batters, if you will, fail 70% of the time when they're up. A 300 hitter in baseball is an all-star, is a Hall of Famer, which means 70% of the time they're failing. And the recruiting world is much like that, and so different than so many other kind of worlds that people live in. And it can be a difficult thing to deal with. So I've been studying this rejection and this failure thing for a while now, and in kind of God's circuitous way of being sovereign has kind of led me to, of all things, great leadership. How does somebody start out studying failure and rejection and end at great, not just great, but really phenomenal, the best leadership? That's kind of the place that I'm in now. What is the bridge that connects those two, failure and the best leadership? And that's kind of what I want to talk about in this video. And there is a bridge, and there is a connector, and that one word that connects failure to great leadership is humility. Humility. Failure brings humility, and humility is the foundation of not just good leadership, but really the best leadership. And that's just not what I say. This has been borne out in social studies. And perhaps the most famous one is this guy named Jim Collins, who's a social researcher and wrote a phenomenal book called, many of you have probably heard or read about, called Good to Great. And he started out by asking two questions. Can a good company become a great company? That was one question that drove his research. Can a good company become a great company? Second question was how? If so, how? How does a good company become a great company? And so that set him on a 5-year study looking at great companies, what they had in common, and how they got there. And one of his main kind of findings was this kind of leadership pyramid as well. And I'm going to put a picture up there. I'm going to move over to give some room so you can see the picture as I kind of talk about it. So he talked about these 5 levels of leadership. And obviously the top is the phenomenal. It is the transformational. It is the best leadership. And I'm just going to start up there. And he said that's the leadership that doesn't just kind of produce results, but it creates a culture that lasts. It creates a culture that endures. In other words, long after this particular leader is gone, what he or she has done to put into the DNA of that organization will take it into continued greatness. And he said that a leader of that magnitude is driven by 2 things. Number one, there's self-will, but the other thing that characterizes that leader is humility. Personal humility. And that's what we're reaching at, and that's where failure starts us on the road to, believe it or not. And so what right now might be this painful, crushing personal failure might be a step on the road to ultimately giving us the foundation to be that great transformational executive leader. But it does start out, if you look at the bottom there, as normally what we would kind of intuitively think make the great leaders, and that is the gifted person, the one with the raw skills. This is the bottom level of the leadership principles that Jim Collins borne out. The charismatic, the smart. When we think about what characterizes a great leader, you know, we think about the charismatic. We think about the strong, the good-looking, the smart, the articulate, all those different things. That's kind of what the culture tells us about leadership, or what our intuition tells us. But no, Jim Collins found out that great leadership is born out of humility. So I'm going to take this picture down. I'm going to move back, and I want to kind of talk about this kind of humble thing. You know, failure sets us on a path. Rejection can bring us to this point of failure where it sets us kind of on a fork in the road. And when we're dealing with failure, as some of you are dealing with now, we can veer in one direction that will bring us to a place of shame. And shame can destroy our lives, and shame can destroy our relationships, or take a different path, and failure can propel us to humility. And Jim Collins told us where humility can bring us. But I want to look at two questions. Number one, what does humility look like? And two, what does humility do to us? And in order to do that, I want to look at this passage of Scripture from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 8, verses, we're just going to look at two verses, verses 2 and 3. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 2 and 3. In this passage, Moses, the leader of the Israelites, is kind of giving a pep talk to all the Israelites as they prepare to enter the promised land. They had walked through the desert for 40 years. It had been trying, it had been telling, and they had been humbled. And Moses is going to remind them of that. But he's also going to say, but the humbling that you've experienced in that time has built within you strength and wisdom that will propel you to success, that will propel you up the ladder or pyramid of Jim Collins' leadership model, if you will. So I want to look at these two verses and focus on how humility is going to propel these Israelites, Moses is saying, to good things. He says this. He says to them, again, as they're about to enter the promised land, they're on the verge of something great. They're not there yet, though. And they had been through hard times. He says, remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the desert these 40 years to humble you and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. That's verse 2. Moses says that you were in the desert, and one of the things that was going on, you were being humbled to test you in order to know what was in your heart. And so at the end of all of this trial that they went through, they knew who they were. They knew what was in their heart. They knew what their motivation was. So point number one about humility is that humility develops self-awareness. What is in your heart? Why do you do what you do? When the mask is ripped off, and failure will rip off our masks, what is left? Who is the real Jim Sousa? The humble person knows what's in their heart. The humble person knows themselves, and that brings confidence, and that brings wisdom that a tragedy or a storm cannot take away. I know who I am, and that's a good thing. So that's point number one, is that humility develops self-awareness. The next point comes from the next verse, where Moses says in verse 3, it says, God humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna which you nor your fathers had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. So the first thing we looked at in verse 2 is that humility develops self-awareness. What's going on here? What did the Israelites learn according to this verse while they were in the desert? First thing Moses says is that you learn that you don't live on bread alone. We could kind of translate that in a way where Moses was saying, you learn that you cannot do it all yourself. And all up to that point, you might have been successful on your own smarts, and on your own strength, and on your own speed, and on your own good looks, articulate, and all that good, on all your own gifts. You might be that natural born leader that Jim Collins talked about at the bottom of that pyramid. But while you were in the desert, you learned that you could not rely on that. No matter how strong you were, you can't do it all yourself. That's the point. The humble person learns that they cannot do it all themselves. But then Moses goes on and he says, you don't live on bread alone, but you live on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. In other words, oh, you might not be able to do it all yourself, but you don't need. And here's the good news, to do it all yourself. That's the third thing. Humility develops self-awareness. Humility forces us to learn that we can't do it all ourselves. Humility opens up to this wonderful reality that we don't have to do it all yourself. It is okay to ask for help. It is okay to receive help. As a matter of fact, you can reach a certain level on your own, but if you want to reach the greatness of leadership or success that Jim Collins talks about, as this transformational leader, you need others. You need people to help you. And the Israelites learned this in the desert. They learned that they could get so far on their own, but you don't live by bread alone. Also what God can give you as well. And maybe that help will come from God, or maybe that help will come from your staff, or your battle buddy, or your spouse, or a friend. But it is okay, not just okay, it is necessary to ask for help. So those are the three things I think that humility can teach us. It can give us that level of self-awareness we would not have had otherwise. It can remind us that we can't do it ourselves. And number three, that we don't need to do it ourselves. And failure, rejection can bring about the failure. Failure can bring about that humility in us that can propel us, knowing these three things. Failure is like a wine press. It's crushing when we're going through it. It's painful when we're going through it. But the end product can be positive, can be beneficial, and can produce something good. It can produce a person who is self-aware. It can produce a person who knows they can't do it themselves, and it can produce a person who knows they don't have to do it themselves. In other words, it can produce a humble person, which is inessential. You cannot be a great leader without being humble. And in the next couple of weeks of these resiliency messages, I want to look at two different case studies of men from the Bible who went through this journey of failure, humility, and great success. Failure, humility, and exceptional leadership. The first is going to be the Apostle Peter. The second is going to be Moses. I want to end with this, the qualities of a humble leader. The humble leader is going to have these qualities. Number one, humble leaders give credit to others. Number two, humble leaders admit mistakes. Number three, humble leaders accept constructive feedback. Number four, humble leaders help others. Number five, humble leaders, and I'll get out of the way so you can see that, humble leaders, like Moses learned in the Israelites in the desert, know they need help. Failure is a spot on the journey. And depending on which direction that failure brings you, shame can be negative. Humility, which is what we talked about today, can be incredibly positive. Not just positive, but it can be the foundation of greatness which is yet to come. So be encouraged, walk in peace, and have the best day possible.